Libyan Sojourn. Misurata, that sleepy town some 200 miles east of Tripoli, had been in the news lately. It had become a key center in the revolt against Gaddafi. Its quiet streets and the town square had become scenes of bloody and brutal conflict. To Faraz, it all seemed so far away, and his time there a distant dream. He remembered the interview in a hotel in downtown Toronto some 3 decades ago, the first step in the process that had led him to a town that he had never heard of, to a job that even then had seemed like something of a mirage. Job interviews had always struck him as somewhat bizarre. How could a 20-minute encounter with its series of fake questions and answers determine whether you would turn out to be a good employee or whether the job would turn out to be the right fit for you? This particular interview was even more bizarre than most. The interviewer had never identified himself, for one thing. For another, he had not asked Faraz any questions about himself. Nothing about how his students would describe him or how he saw himself in 10 years. It was sufficient that his resume indicated he had university degrees, and to his relief, he did not have to explain the periods of and underemployment, which was somewhat glossed over in the resume. The interviewer stressed the benefits and entitlements that came with the job. Faraz would be allowed to send half of what he earned back to Canada, converting dinars to dollars. His flights to Libya and back would be paid for, and he would even receive airfare for himself and, if applicable, his family, to go back to Canada during the summer holidays. He would be provided accommodation at no cost, and there would also be a furniture allowance of 400 dinars a month. To someone who had been working precariously as a substitute teacher for a while, this all sounded promising. He pictured himself in a fancy store in Tripoli, checking out the Italian leather sofas and Murano glass. At the end of the interview, Faraz asked the interviewer whether he was at the university himself. This seemed to cause the interviewer some embarrassment, and he hesitated before revealing that while he was of Libyan origin, he worked in Canada. He would not indicate where he worked and what he did, but did say he was doing the interviewing to help someone out. Later, when Faraz met the motley crew that had been hired and learned that everyone who had been interviewed had been offered a position, he realized that their interviewer had not been particularly concerned about the quality of the new recruits, or hires as they are now called. By the same token, all of them seemed to be desperate enough to grasp at any straws that promised some degree of employment security. There were 5 of them. They were all flotsam of one sort or another. They were either not cut out to be teachers or were simply victims of poor timing and circumstance. Faraz had made the mistake of moving to Canada with an American qualification when Canadian schools and universities were recovering from a period during which they had gone overboard in welcoming American academics fleeing from the draft and Richard Nixon. Not only was there the inevitable backlash, but teaching jobs at all levels had also become scarce. Samir had no doubt been a promising scholar in Damascus, but he had been unable to find anything other than temporary work in Canada. Mark was somewhat harder to categorize. Of Polish origin, he was more of a jock than an academic. He would probably have become a car salesman if this teaching opportunity had not come his way. Althea, a recent immigrant from the Caribbean, was the only woman. Being Black and female was not then the advantage it might now be in certain contexts, and certainly would not be an advantage in an Arab country. She had the temerity to take on this adventure with a young child, a 2-year-old called Jackson. The most interesting and questionable selection was that of the Englishman Paul. Originally from London, he was really a sailor and had spent much of his life taking on jobs on ferry boats and cargo ships. Paul had been working on the Toronto Island ferry in the summers. He managed to get himself on the substitute teacher's list so he could earn a bit of money when the island ferry work dried up at the end of summer and before it got too cold and his gout forced him to move to a warmer climate for a few months. He wrote somewhat laboriously in capital letters with occasional misspelled words, but he did reasonably well as a substitute teacher, a role in which the ability to maintain order in the boys' gym has always been more important than knowing how to spell. The five met first in Malta, where they waited for their visas. Later in Tripoli, they waited to sign their contracts. Hierarchies and allegiances formed quickly. Althea, from the time she arrived, was constantly in search of disposable diapers for Jackson. In Tripoli, they did a little bit of sightseeing, which included an impressive arch from the time of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and a museum of antiquities. As for more recent history, there was Green Square, where Gaddafi had hanged seditious students in the presence of their parents. At first, the five did their sightseeing and walked around together. On the first day that they were out, the call to prayer sounded, and Althea's alarmed reaction caused some amusement. Paul later said to Faraz that he could not understand why people would go to a place without bothering to learn something about it. Paul also frequently said other interesting things about travel. According to him, it was not enough to know what were the taboos in a particular culture. It was also necessary to know when the taboos did not apply. On the second day, walking around Tripoli, they discovered that there were no bookstores, and the only book that one could find anywhere was Gaddafi's Green Book. This was a great disappointment to Paul and Faraz. Althea, on the other hand, was delighted to find a store that had stacks of disposable diapers. She bought several packages of these and then looked around at the four men hopefully. Paul and Mike didn't take the hint, and Faraz followed their example. In the end, Samir ended up carrying most of the packages. Paul later told Faraz that if you made the mistake of helping an unaccompanied woman once, then you were stuck forever. Paul had lots of advice about women. You make your own bed was something he would often say. Althea's first priority when they reached Misrata was to find someone to take care of a child while she was at work. In Misrata, they were to set up the English department of a new university. They were temporarily lodged in a little funduk till suitable accommodations were found for everyone. Samir and Althea chose flats in town, but Mark and Paul had their eyes on some apartment buildings by the sea. These were used mostly by Eastern European expatriate workers as holiday accommodation in the summer. The local inhabitants kept away from this area and, in effect, turned their backs on the sea. Curious when one reflects on the fact that they were presumably descended from Phoenicians and other seafaring peoples. Faraz decided to throw in his lot with Mark and Paul, who were both excited at the prospect of bathing in the waters of the Mediterranean. There was a serious drawback, however. These apartments did not have a stick of furniture in them. What made this an even greater challenge was the fact that there were no stores where one could spend the furniture allowance that had been allotted. Mark and Paul were not daunted by this, nor by the realization that there was indeed very little to buy in any store. As for groceries, one could get fruits and vegetables in season, but not eggs or any kind of meat that could be considered edible. Faraz managed to find a few used items that someone who was returning to Pakistan wanted to get rid of. These included a bed, a heater, and a fridge. The fridge had to be connected to a transformer. Faraz held two wires in his hand, unsure about how to connect them. In the end, he decided that he had a 50% chance of not being electrocuted, and he went ahead and attached the wires. To his relief, the fridge worked. Generously, he offered space in it to Mark and Paul. His two colleagues had found some deck chairs, and Faraz would find them soaking up the hot Mediterranean sun. Mark, lithe and tall, and Paul, squat but powerfully built. They would lie there for hours each day, and their pale white bodies soon developed impressive tans. They also loved spending time in the water, and Mark managed to lay his hands on some snorkeling equipment and even a surfboard. His happiness was complete. Not much of a swimmer himself, Faraz watched in awe as Mark swam with ease to a small island in the distance. It was Paul, however, that he came to hold in special esteem. It was not so much the stories of being a spy in Hong Kong or a mercenary in Angola or being kidnapped and tortured in Guatemala. These were probably just sailors' yarns. The fact that he had a seaman's papers was impressive enough. That he was a seasoned sailor was obvious when you saw the huge metal trunk that he traveled with, and when you observed its contents. Not only did he have tools such as a screwdriver, pliers, and a hammer, but he had also brought some shoe polishing equipment, tea bags, and a complete set of spices, including curry powder. It turned out that they did not have to start teaching as yet. Apparently, all the students were busy with military exercises in the desert. Even though there were no students, the teachers were required to attend every day for a few hours. To their chagrin, Faraz and Samir, who had higher salaries and academic status because of their advanced degrees, found a different hierarchy at work in the matter of allocating office furniture. A sort of racial hierarchy seemed to prevail here, with Paul and Mark getting large desks beside windows, and Faraz and Samir being provided smaller desks and uncomfortable chairs. Althea was worst off with a tiny little table in a dark corner of the room. The head of the department, who was of course a Libyan, had his own office. Dr. Baha was a rotund, intellectual-looking man in his 30s. He spoke good English and seemed to have a genial disposition. On the second day, Dr. Baha called a meeting at which it was decided that they were to prepare a diagnostic test for the students. They would work on this as a group, and then it would have to be typed and copied. Dr. Baha asked if anyone was willing to do the typing. As no one else volunteered, Faraz said he would do it. He had never really learned to type and only used 2 fingers, but he had managed to type his dissertation and thought he could handle a few pages. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Baha had a surprise for his staff. He produced 24 eggs for them to share. At the Fundak, a boiled egg had been served at breakfast every morning. But ever since the group had moved out, eggs had been hard to come by. Thus, that night's dinner of scrambled eggs prepared by Paul was a real treat. Paul enjoyed cooking and would often make dinner for the 3 beachside dwellers to share. As there were not too many options, dinner was usually some kind of pasta with canned tomato sauce. On occasion, Faraz would use Paul's spices to make a vegetable curry, cabbage, turnip, whatever was seasonal. Milk and peanuts were always readily available and provided much of their protein intake. Many products were never available except through clandestine sources. Others showed up sporadically. The diapers in Tripoli that Althea found were no doubt there because a shipment had just come in. If one ever saw a lineup, it was a good idea to join in because it meant that a shipment of something must have arrived, bananas or cartons of juice. You would buy as much of whatever it was as you could carry. You would receive a hero's welcome when you got back to wherever you lived. And of course, you would share your spoils with your friends and neighbors. It was not just food and diapers that you had to look out for. Mark and Paul, having given up on the thought of buying furniture, decided that they would make their own. They managed to find a store that sold them a couple of saws and some hardware. They learned that a shipment of plywood was imminent, and when it arrived, they were first in line to buy a few sheets. Even with the daily reporting that was required, which the two took a lot less seriously than the others, they had lots of hours to spare in the afternoons. Soon they were busy at work, sawing and hammering, till eventually they had each made a bed out of plywood. They had picked up an odd chair or other item here and there, and Mark was satisfied that he could manage with whatever he possessed. Paul, on the other hand, was not content simply with furniture in terms of function. He began to scour the beaches for pieces of driftwood and began to combine them with plywood to make odd-looking little coffee tables and stools. On Faraz's birthday, Paul surprised him by making a shelf for his shaving equipment and toiletries. But he also presented him with a spectacular piece of driftwood that was intended to be purely decorative. Paul joked that his presents were creations of the Robinson Crusoe School of Furniture Design. On campus, it was rumored that the students would soon return from their military adventures. Dr. Baha had been pleased with the diagnostic test that the teachers had prepared. He must have also liked the typing job that Faraz had done. One morning, he called Faraz into his office and told him that he would like him to type up some reports that he had written. Faraz froze for a moment. He realized that if he accepted this task, it was not just that he would have to do a lot more of Dr. Baha's typing, but that he would be accepting the inferior status that would go with the role of typist. He was not a very courageous person, but he knew that to agree would be a big mistake. So he said, "I am sorry, Dr. Baha. I wasn't hired to do typing." It wasn't the answer Dr. Baha had expected. Hardly able to contain his displeasure, he wagged his finger at Faraz and said sternly, "No more eggs." Faraz turned on his heels and walked quickly out of the room. It was a relief to get away from the office that afternoon. It dawned on Faraz that nothing made sense about the job he had signed up for. Perhaps there were really no students after all. Perhaps the whole enterprise was a not so grand illusion. With these thoughts churning through his head, Faraz decided to go for a jog on the beach. As he ran, he passed banks of packed sand on which lonely Eastern European men had carved the names of absent women: Olga, Petra, Joanna. On his right, the sea was calm, and a few Bangladeshi fishermen in boats were fishing or in the process of bringing in their catch. It all seemed so peaceful, but perhaps this was also illusory. He had noted guards in their little huts scanning the sea to the north. Reagan had made warlike noises, and there was fear that Libya would be attacked by the Americans. Faraz had also noticed some military activity in the camps that were strategically placed to the rear of the accommodation provided for foreigners on the beach. This was standard practice, using foreign workers as a human shield. When he got back to their building, Paul and Mark were on the veranda sunbathing. "Guess what, Faraz?" said Paul. "After you left, all the teachers were asked to go to the town square and protest against the US and Ronald Reagan. I think you will be docked half a day's pay, as you were supposed to be working." Faraz laughed. "I'm sorry I missed it. Must have been quite an experience." "Yes," said Mark, "I wouldn't have missed it for the world. We gathered in the town square under all those giant portraits of Gaddafi and shouted defiant slogans." "Yes, most of the slogans were in Arabic," said Paul. "But for the benefit of any Americans who might be watching on Al Jazeera, some were in English. Oh, my favorite was Reagan dog, shame, shame. Before long, the students came back from their military exercises. The 5 Canadian teachers were given various classes to teach. Faraz was assigned a very large class of undergraduate students to whom he was supposed to teach English. He also had to teach linguistics to a smaller group of students who actually spoke surprisingly good English. They were all senior students in the English department, and it seemed to him that some of them probably knew more about linguistics than he did. His larger class, on the other hand, consisted of students who were not too interested in learning English. There were far too many students to really allow for any meaningful teaching. He followed what seemed to be the normal practice of setting multiple choice tests. On one occasion, he caught a student copying answers from another student and told them that he was going to take off marks from both of them. That evening, they showed up at his place on the beach with a couple of cartons of Alhani cigarettes for him. They found it hard to understand that he wouldn't take their gift, nor would he change their marks. It was now getting cooler at night, and Faraz was glad that he had a heater. He had not expected that North Africa would get quite so cold. To their horror, the beach dwellers discovered one day that their water supply had been shut down. What had been forgotten when the beach apartments were offered was the fact that these were only used in the summer. Someone had failed to ensure that water would continue to be provided to the 3 Canadian teachers. Eventually, the water supply was restored, and all seemed to be fine. Among the things Paul told Faraz about travel was that you had to stay at least a full year in any place to really know it. You had to experience each season. Faraz, however, ever since being threatened with egg deprivation, had been thinking about breaking his contract. This was not going to be easy, as you would have to get an exit visa. However, in special circumstances, leave would be allowed during the break between semesters in March. Samir, who had a young family and had come to the conclusion that it would not be a good idea to have them join him in Libya, also began to think about breaking his contract. Apparently, some teachers had absconded in previous years, and this made it harder to get permission to leave Libya. One result was that the university deliberately kept the payment of salaries in arrears. Faraz and Samir had to plan their escape very carefully. It did not seem fair not to warn the other 3. It was a risk that they had to take, knowing that those who remained behind would no doubt have to take on additional teaching loads. There were a few students that Faraz had gotten close to. One of them was a young man named Butros, who had invited him to his home for lunch. Butros's mother had served camel meat, which Faraz ate for the first time. He knew it was a risk, but he told Butros that he was leaving Libya for good and said that he trusted him not to mention this to anyone. Fortunately, the need for secrecy is something that Libyan young men understood. Butros asked Faraz to write to him from Canada and gave him his address. Both Faraz and Samir had to buy return tickets to allay suspicion. Till the day that they left, they were afraid that somehow or other their secret plan would be discovered. It is only when they were safely on board and in the air that they could breathe easily again. Not long after their departure, Reagan did carry out his threats and bombed Tripoli. Misrata was spared on that occasion, but years later, in the revolt against Gaddafi, there was a lot of bloodshed and atrocities were committed on both sides. Reagan by then had passed away peacefully after some years of senility, while Gaddafi ended up being killed like a dog by fellow Libyans. Faraz wondered how his students, whom he had known for such a short time, had fared through that violent period, as well as its chaotic and uncertain aftermath. Of the other teachers who had set out from Canada with high expectations, Althea completed her year, while Paul and Mark did go back for a further year, at the end of which a bonus had been promised. The only person Faraz kept in touch with was Paul, whom he never met again, but from whom he received occasional postcards. Paul had been spending his winters in various places, most frequently Goa, which was cheap and on the ocean. The last time Faraz heard from him, he was working on a boat that sailed between Tahiti and Australia. Wherever he ended up, Faraz hoped it was someplace warm by a body of water.